All right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are welcoming you to How to Thrive in a Time of Stress and Uncertainty here with Dr. Larry Richard, who is the founder and principal consultant of Lawyer Brain LLC. I will let Dr. Richard introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his background as well as jump right in. He is one of my all-time favorite speakers, so I'm really excited to introduce him to all of you and have him speak to us this morning, this afternoon for some of you. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Richard, and welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and hello, everybody. So, quick background, I started out in law at age 2. I know that sounds like a joke, but I come from a family of 3 generations of lawyers. My father, my grandfather, aunts, uncles, cousins, that was kind of the family business. And I practiced law for 10 years as a litigator and burnt out. And then after that, did some soul searching and realized that the one true love I've always had was psychology. And so I returned to get a PhD in psychology, which I did in the 90s, and studied lawyers. And I've been studying lawyers ever since. I've been studying our personalities, what makes us tick, and the functioning of law firms, all with the goal of improving performance and satisfaction. Those are the 2 main outcomes that I go for in my consulting work with the legal profession. So today, we're going to talk about the pandemic and how it's affected everyone. I'm going to divide this into 3 buckets. The first topic, I'm going to talk about the psychological consequences of the pandemic. We're all certainly feeling some consequences, but there's some stuff going on behind the scenes in our brains that I want to help you understand. Understanding that will help us when we get to the third topic. Before we do, we'll talk about why all of those psychological consequences that I've helped you understand are actually worse for us, and there are reasons for that. And the main reason, I will keep you in suspense until we get to those slides. And then once I've worked you into a state of suicidal state of depression, don't quit the webinar at that point, because everything else that I'm going to talk about is antidotes to that stress and solutions. And I'd like to take us beyond just managing the stress and go toward thriving. So we'll see if we can do that. So I want to start with this idea that there's enormous stress when we have a crisis like a pandemic. It has visible and invisible psychological consequences, and also physiological consequences, because the mind and the body, we've learned over the years, are intimately connected. And every time, for example, you have an emotional response, it's always embodied. There's always a physiological response. And so whether your body or mind reacts first, both of them ultimately are going to react. Now, we have 3 fundamental human needs that everybody has a need for. And this virus, this crisis, has disrupted all 3 of those needs. So what are these needs? The first one is that we all have a need for predictability. We want to wake up in the morning and be assured that the floor beneath our feet hasn't shifted. And, metaphorically, we want to know that life continues the way we expect it to, and the more unstable our regular expectations are, the more unstable our world is, the more our brain focuses its core resources on protecting us from threat instead of doing the job that we're focused on for work or for our relationships or personal life. The second need we all have is a need to feel in control, need for autonomy, need to feel like I call the shots within some area of my life. And that has been constrained by some of the safety responses, if you will, to trying to stem the spread of the virus. The side effect of those perhaps very wise interventions is that it's cut down on our control. And we all have a need for connection, something that's very important in general. We as lawyers tend to devalue it, or at least deprioritize it more than other people do, and I'll explain why that's so in a little bit. But these needs have all been disrupted. So let's take a deeper dive. Predictability is important because it's not just a need, it's a core need in terms of the very mechanism that keeps us alive. Our brain has a circuitry that I call the threat sensing circuitry. And there are several structures in our brain, including two organs on either side of the brain called the amygdala, which are designed to detect any threat that's coming in. And it's on 24/7 when you're awake, when you're asleep. Even right now, and I'm not even thinking about my amygdala, it's active, scanning my environment, and ready at any moment to mentally tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, you better pay attention to this. So what is the criteria that our threat sensing circuitry uses? It's change and uncertainty. So whenever our threat sensing circuit detects something changing, it asks, am I familiar with this change? Is this something expected? Is it unexpected? Is this something that could cause any harm? Normally, those little, triggers, little changes that we go through every day, make minor inroads in our threat sensing circuitry, and we don't even consciously notice them. I mean, you're driving on the highway and you hit a bump or a rough patch and you automatically adjust to it without even thinking of it. That's your threat sensing circuitry at work. You could probably continue a conversation without missing a beat. So it's background. Now, in addition to the background stuff, there are three conditions, three properties that can trigger the highest level of alert of that circuitry, what I call red alert. If the change is really sudden and unexpected, it'll not only tap us on the mental shoulder, but it'll say, hey, drop everything, this is important. Number two, if the change is outside of our control. And number three, if the potential of the change, of the threat, is so serious that it could hurt us or cause death. Now, right now, the pandemic has checked all three of those boxes. And all we need is one to elevate our threat signal to the highest level. And as if that weren't enough, this circuitry, anthropologists tell us that this evolved as a circuitry to defend against episodic threats. What's an episodic threat? It's something that has a start, middle, and an end. It's over fairly quickly. Take, for example, a loud noise that you weren't expecting. You're in your home and you hear a noise. What was that? And you're on alert. All your attention is now suddenly riveted on the noise and what potentially could be causing it. And when you discover it's a window shade that's banging against an open window, you go, oh, heave a sigh of relief, turn my attention back to what I was doing. That's episodic. And our circuitry is well designed for that type of short-term interruption that has closure. We don't have that right now. We have an unending, no endpoint in sight, out of control, multifaceted, continuing source of threat. And that is frying our circuitry. So that puts us in pretty bad shape. And that alone would be enough to cause stress and irritability and distractibility and a whole bunch of other side effects. But that's not the only thing. Our need for control has been disrupted. Like I said, we want to know what's going on and we want to feel like we control some of what's going on. But now we're being told we have to either be in a lockdown or quarantine or stay away from large gatherings or wear a mask or socially distance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while those are wise precautions to keep us from getting infected, they also constrain our autonomy. And a lot of people find that off-putting, and it takes us psychologically to a place of less well-being than when we don't have those constraints. In addition, connection is disrupted. When we're in our workplace, we don't even think about the fact that those little moments when we see somebody in the hallway and we acknowledge them, or we hang around the coffee machine, or we talk about what was on TV last night, those little moments of brief interactions in the workplace, studies have shown that those brief interactions actually are extremely important for our well-being, our psychological and our physical well-being. And we've lost a lot of that if you're working from home. In many cases, you can't visit friends that are kind of the lifeblood of a happy life. If you have people in your family or friend circle that are in the hospital. Often hospitals prohibit us from coming and visiting them. The daily camaraderie of the office has disappeared. So these things all cause us to be more irritable, a little bit more depressed, more distractible as well. Now, everything I've said to this point is about people in general, not about lawyers. Lawyers experience all of those things, and we experience them worse. And here's why. We're trained to think negatively. Now, if you just heard a voice in your head say, no, we're not, that's what I'm talking about. Now, where does that come from? Our training in law school is to look for issues, spot issues, look for problems, ask questions like what could go wrong, what is wrong, what are the exceptions rather than looking at what's working. And that's really a good type of thinking to protect our clients. But it's very, very toxic in terms of managing our sense of predictability, managing relationships, feeling in control. Negative thinking can undermine us psychologically. So our personality, here's a question to ask yourself. If the profession requires you to do all this negative thinking, what kind of a person would come into that profession, like the profession, stay in the profession, and thrive in the profession? And the answer is somebody who has a personality that's a little different from the typical mainstream general public, someone who has a personality well suited to that kind of thinking. So we're going to look at the lawyer personality, because the people who enter the legal profession, my research over almost 30 years has shown that the people who become lawyers are outliers. We're not like the other folks. We're atypical. So I want to look at the data that I have the most of that I've gathered over the last, in this case, 27 years. This is an industrial strength personality tool called the Caliper Profile. It measures 18 different personality traits, 18 distinct, independent, workplace-related personality traits. We all use these traits in greater or lesser proportions. And Caliper's been around since 1964, so this stuff has been tried and tested and tweaked and updated. It's a very fine, statistically valid and reliable tool. Caliper themselves, over that time, has tested in excess of 6 million people, mostly college educated and above. And I have tested close to 6,000 lawyers, including 250 law firm leaders, including lawyers and C-level people. Each trait in the Caliper is measured on a percentile scale. That means we're being compared to a norm group, people like us. And if you had a 99% in a trait, I have a 99 myself on a trait called urgency, which is why I'm talking so fast. High urgency people are atypical. The typical for any trait is 50%, because high and low scores cancel out in a large population sample. So you always get an average across any sample of around 50. Now, if you take, instead of the general population, you take a particular trade or occupation like accountant or teacher or lawyer, you would expect most of the 18 traits would average at 50%. You'll see individual scores all over the map, but each trait should average at 50. But in an occupation, often there are traits that are useful for that occupation or not useful, and you'll see that the scores are not exactly on the 50% mark, but they always stay within the guardrails, which is what we technically call the standard deviation. So in this case, it's between 40 and 60%. In almost every occupation you measure, every one of the 18 traits will fall between 40 and 60%, except for one. And in this one unusual outlier occupation, 7 of the 18 traits are below 40 or above 60 on average. That's just astonishing. And of course, it's us. So what are these 7 traits? Number 1 is high autonomy. We have this extraordinarily high need to be in control. We don't like people telling us what to do. And that's why practicing law is a very, very good place for people who like autonomy. That's why high autonomy people go into the profession, because we pretty much run our own practice. Nobody tells us how to do that. So it's a good thing in most normal times. But in the time of a pandemic, we suffer more because high autonomy people have a greater need for control. So when that control is disrupted, it hurts us more. Number two, we have high abstract reasoning. We like analyzing, we like logic, we like mental stimulation, we like arguing. And we get to do that a lot in our work. However, there's a small side effect is number one is analysis paralysis. We tend to overthink problems. And because we like arguing for the fun of it, sometimes we'll argue, for example, with authorities that are trying to impose some of the preventive measures that I mentioned earlier. Number three, I've already mentioned that I'm high in autonomy, in urgency rather. Lawyers are too, lawyers in general. So we have a 21% higher one. In the public's at 50, we're at 71. This means we're impatient. We want to get things to the finish line. In most conditions, this is a good thing because clients want us to be responsive and we are urgent. So it's a personality trait that serves our needs as lawyers. But it also has a downside because we can be impulsive. And when you're battling an infectious disease, being impulsive can get you in trouble. Number four, we are low in resilience. This is a really, really important trait because it's so atypical. What is resilience? Resilience is a measure of how thick or thin skinned you are in the face of adversity, criticism, rejection, etc. So there are two things that highly resilient people do well. First, let's take criticism. A high resilience person, when you criticize them, is not going to react. They don't feel the pain of the criticism. They just go, yeah, whatever, you know, it's somebody else's problem. Or if it does affect them, they bounce back really quickly and robustly. It doesn't hurt them. So look at the number for us as lawyers. We're 20% lower at 30 instead of 50. But look at the note at the top of the page. 90% of lawyers score below the 50th percentile. We are very thin-skinned as a group. So here is the 50% mark. The yellow represents the distribution of lawyer scores. So you can see 9 out of 10 lawyers score in the lower half of the scale. It's a distorted perspective I've shown you. It doesn't look like it's right in the middle, the 50% mark, because I didn't have room to put all of us in there. So this is where the 30% is. You can see when I say 9 out of 10 lawyers are thin-skinned, if you feel bad just hearing that statistic, it illustrates the very trait that we're talking about. Resilience is important because when you're low in resilience, you feel hurt, wounded when you're criticized. You feel defensive. You may try to explain yourself. No, wait, I had a good reason for doing that. You may counterattack and try to pin something on somebody else. We just don't want to take in the criticism. And my favorite, low resilience people can even see negativity in a compliment. So let's say we're walking down the main street in your city and we see a beautiful clothing shop, a high-end clothing shop, and I look in the window and I say, wow, look at that beautiful outfit in the window. You'd look terrific in that. If you're a high resilience person, you say, thank you, because it was a compliment. If you're a low resilience, you say, what, you don't like what I'm wearing? That's low resilience. So when you're low resilient, you don't like trying new behaviors because any risk, any type of behavior that you're not comfortable with, you haven't rehearsed it, you're not familiar, that can make you feel one down. And so low resilience people are much more cautious about dipping their toe in the water, even when it's advisable. Why are we so low in resilience? For years, I couldn't figure that out because this is the most reliable trait. Every year I tested, it's the same. It's 30%, 90% of us in the bottom half. It just doesn't change. And it turns out that recent research helped us understand why we are so low. There are two main things that boost resilience, and we're not good on either of them. Number one is realistic optimism. This is not the rose-colored glasses, everything's going to be fine type of optimism. This is optimism of the sort that says, okay, something bad happened. I got criticized. I, had a problem with a legal document that I drafted, whatever. And the optimist says, okay, it's not a great thing that I did, but luckily, you know, in perspective, it's probably not as bad as some things that could have happened. In 2 weeks, it probably won't feel nearly as bad. Luckily, there are a lot of other things that people know me for that I'm, you know, given a lot of credit for, and I'm seen as competent in. So this won't leave any sort of a mark. A pessimist might catastrophize and say, "Oh my God, life is over. I'm going to be out of a job, and you know, people will remember this for the rest of my career." And we tend to exaggerate. The second thing that keeps resilience high is good social connection. When we have ongoing networks of authentic, even vulnerable connections with other people. Lawyers, as a general rule, find this off-putting. We tend to trivialize relationships. And yet the research shows that relationships are so important to not only build resilience, but for a bunch of other things I'll show you in a minute. So let's see how lawyers score on these two things. If we're on the optimistic side, that would support our resilience. If we're pessimistic, it would hurt our resilience. Well, there's one trait, it's not exactly pessimism, but it travels in the same direction as pessimism, and that is skepticism. So where are lawyers? Remember, the public's at 50. The average for lawyers is 90%. 90%, because this is the embodiment of the personality trait that captures the task that we do as lawyers. So if our mission as lawyers is to protect our clients by looking for problems, then a personality trait that looks for problems would be a welcome blessing for doing that job. And so we have the task itself and the personality stacked on top of that. We've got two reasons to be skeptical: personality and job, job role, tasks, obligations. So we're very skeptical. Number two, how do we do with social connection? There's a trait called sociability, which measures our inclination to initiate intimacy or, you know, reveal something about ourselves to deepen a social connection. High-scoring people are very open and interested in connecting at an emotional level. Low-scoring people don't even like the language that I'm using. Ooh, connection, you know, intimacy, vulnerability, ooh. That's something we can put aside, and let's just talk about economics or politics or you know, world affairs. Low-scoring people are very private. So how do, and by the way, I forgot to mention, skepticism is great for practicing law, but it means that we can hurt our own interests in a crisis like we have now. So when we are on sociability at 12%, you can make your own joke here. My standard joke is that a potted plant is 8%. 12 is very low for sociability. We're just very private. We don't like to reveal much about ourselves at all. And we don't like any talk about relationships. Now that's unfortunate because the research on relationships is so compelling. I'm going to give you one example that comes from a longitudinal study. It's the longest longitudinal study ever done. It's still going on at Harvard. And they've studied hundreds of people over the last 80 plus years and asked them lots of questions, gathered medical data and all kinds of things. And the third of the current, there are four psychologists that have been in charge of this program over the last 80 years. Number three, George Valiant, who stepped down just a couple years ago, said that there are 5 things that all human beings want. And they are, we all want life satisfaction. We want to have a meaningful life. We all want work satisfaction. We want to feel like we're doing something important that has an impact, and we feel competent increasingly over time. We all want long-term satisfying relationships with someone who loves us and sees us for who we really are and accepts us for that, flaws and all. We all want to live a long life, and we all want to have good health and good immune system during that life. Well, guess what factor is a significant, highly significant, sometimes the most significant predictor in all 5 of these things? George Valiant distilled it down to one thing: social connection, or as he said, love full stop. This explains the power of connection on relationships, on work satisfaction, life satisfaction, immune response. So it's unfortunate that we devalue that. Low sociability can make us underestimate the importance of social connection. I've talked to a number of lawyers and I say, do you miss the camaraderie of the office? Yeah, sure, but it's, not a big thing. Well, it is a big thing. It matters greatly. Now, the seventh trait was not on the radar screen. Any of you who have read my articles over the years on personality, I've always talked about the 6 traits that I just finished. Empathy, in this case, cognitive empathy, which is a type of empathy where we're intellectually stepping into the shoes of another person, that has always been low for lawyers. It was 41% on average for many years. And technically, I couldn't call it an outlier because it has to be below 40 for that to be technically an outlier. It's always been low. Well, it's been dropping. It's been dropping precipitously. It's now down to, let me show you. So millennials, this is not just for lawyers. There's a trend across the world. Millennials, in one study about 10 years ago, had 40% lower empathy than Gen X, the previous generation. So it's a very important trait for leadership. It's a very important trait for mentoring. It's a very important trait for coping with crisis. So how do we score on cognitive empathy? We were at 41, we're now down to 38 and dropping. So this is really, really important. Why does that matter? Because it literally affects every other trait that I've talked about and every problem that I've identified. So all of this adds lots of challenges. We're more distractible under this crisis than the average person. We are channeling more of our negative emotions and pessimism. We're looking for all the things that could go wrong. It brings out our worst. We all have a best and worst side. This brings out our worst. We trust information sources less than other people. And it increases homophily, which is a technical term for simply distrusting others. When we're under conditions of stress, of crisis, of uncertainty, it's normal for human brains, not lawyers alone, but it's normal for human brains to circle the wagons and stick with people like me and to be less trusting of people who are different from me in some way. So any of you who are making strides in improving diversity in your office, this puts a little bit of a monkey wrench in those efforts because it psychologically makes us more receptive to messages of we, they, and less likely to respect and tolerate differences. So what can we do to restore these disrupted needs? First, let me talk about how we quiet the brain's threat circuitry, because that's basically going to restore the needs. We can't control the things that are outside of our control that I've already talked about, but what we can do is, in a way, fool the brain in a good way. If I can do things that make my brain feel like something in my life is predictable, then even though the main thing that we're concerned about, the virus, is not predictable, it quiets us, it reassures us, and it makes us feel less stressed and more centered and greater sense of equilibrium. So how do we restore predictability? The first idea here is to create well-formed goals, clear goals. The clearer you are with your own goals, the less stress you're going to feel about unpredictability and uncertainty, because it's something you control. So this channels both predictability and control. Form a clear goal for tomorrow. Form a clear goal for the week, because we've learned from studies that 1 week thinking is one of the most effective timeframes for actually getting things done. And think of long-term 1 year goals. So all 3 of those timeframes are important. The parallel with your interactions with other people are to set clear expectations when you interact with others. So if you give assignments to people, or if you ask people to do something for you, be very clear about what you expect. It helps you, but it also helps them. Number 3, establish a daily routine. So we already have routines, like brushing your teeth is a very widespread routine. We all do that. But we can consciously create other routines, because a routine gives regularity and predictability to the brain and quiets that threat circuitry. If you go on the internet and you look at YouTube and type in Admiral William McRaven and make your bed, he did a video. He's a US Naval Admiral. And he talks in this video about how the simple act of making your bed is the first thing he does every morning sets an expectation. It gives him a sense of accomplishment he can check off. And metaphorically, it makes it more likely that he's going to get things done the rest of the day. But because it's a routine, it also quiets the circuitry in terms of predictability. So create a routine or several of them. And also, the brain is an attention machine. It functions on the basis of attention. What are we paying attention to? And so if you can pay attention by, if you can pay attention to things that haven't changed, what is still predictable in my world? Just focusing your attention on those things is reassuring. So for me, I walk outside of our home and I see our garden. The garden hasn't changed. The garden doesn't care about COVID. The garden looks the same. So it's an anchor of stability in a sea of uncertainty, and it gives my brain something quieting to pay attention to. Excuse me. And finally, in addition to routines, rituals. What's a ritual? It sounds similar to a routine. Think of it as a routine that has the addition of something personal or symbolic embedded in it. So we have rituals for birth and for death and for graduation from school, for entering the bar, for all kinds of things. Create your own rituals around weekly teleconferences, or create rituals around how you start a meeting, or create rituals for reports that you do to each other about revenue, or whatever it is that you're normally focusing attention on. Create some sort of a ritual that has a rhythmicity to it and some symbolic meaning that you attach to it. It again quiets the threat circuitry. How about control? What can we do to restore that sense of control? Again, some suggestions that quite similar to the predictability. Pay attention to things that are still within your control. Here we're directing the brain's attention to what do I still control? And it's not enough that you still control it, it's directing your attention to the fact that you control it. Just by becoming mindful, oh yeah, I do decide this and I do decide that. That's a helpful thing. So creating routines and creating rituals, while they also restore predictability, at the same time, you're the one that's choosing them, so you're giving yourself a sense of control. Also, when you have a choice or when you give an assignment to somebody else, in either of those cases, instead of just saying, do X, you can say, here's a binary choice in how you do X. Would you like to do it this way or that way? Just make up something. It could be as simple as, do you want to email it to me, or do you want to send me a hard copy? I'm just making up a silly example. Do you want to do it, have our meeting in the morning or in the afternoon? Little simple, silly choices, even though they're obvious make-weight choices, they quiet that circuitry as well. And then finally, something that's powerful, instantaneous, and very effective at restoring the sense of control, as well as making you feel calmer and a greater sense of well-being, is to do some deep breathing. So we have a circuit in our body called the parasympathetic nervous system. We have another system that's kind of a counter system called the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight system. It's one when we are feeling stressed out, when we're feeling on edge, alert, distracted. That's our sympathetic nervous system that has been activated. When we feel centered, calm, safe, at ease, that's our parasympathetic nervous system. We've all had experiences of both. I dare challenge everybody on this call, you've never had both of them at the same time, because research shows we can't. They are two independent systems that switch on or off. When one's on, the other is off, and vice versa. So if you can activate your parasympathetic nervous system, you'll turn off the fight-flight system. How do you do that? One very reliable way to activate this parasympathetic calming nervous system is to do some deep breathing. And it's a very particular set of criteria. First, it has to be deeper than your normal breath. In order to do that, you have to shift from autopilot, which is what we call the autonomic nervous system. We're all breathing, everybody up until this point in the call. I know you've all been inhaling and exhaling, and I'll propose that nobody has been thinking, I'm inhaling and exhaling. It's been automatic in the background. we can shift from that automatic system to a consciously directed breathing, which is what starts the process. It's the first step in invoking the parasympathetic nervous system. And the best way to go off autopilot is to change the nature of the breath. So taking a deep breath now is fully manual, fully conscious, fully within your control. And the second part is when you exhale, the real trigger event is when the exhale is longer than the inhale. That long exhale is the body's physiological signal to shift into the parasympathetic nervous system. The last thing is the breath should be deep belly breathing as opposed to shallow chest breathing. So I can take in breaths like a dog, or I can breathe all the way down to the bottom of my belly. And that latter type of breath, when I inhale deeply from there and then I slowly exhale, let's say you inhale to the count of 4 and exhale to the count of 8, that will trigger the parasympathetic nervous system, make you feel in control, and immediately relax you. How about connection? What can you do to restore connection? There's a whole lot of things we're going to talk about here. First, I want to go to the University of Michigan. Well, actually, first I want to review some of the extraordinary benefits in addition to those I already mentioned. Improved immune response, faster recovery from illness, telomeres. Our chromosomes have tips on them. Every chromosome has a tip that's kind of the end of a shoelace, and that tip is called a telomere. And as we age and get more infirm, that telomere shortens. In fact, people have said that shortened telomeres are a marker for unhealthy aging. We used to think that that was irreversible, but they've discovered that positive emotions can reverse the degradation of telomeres and can even re-lengthen the telomeres. So invoking the parasympathetic nervous system is a way of improving your health, including the physiological marker of longer telomeres. And connection is one of the best ways to generate those positive emotions. It also lowers inflammation, which is a cause of many illnesses. It raises our resilience, as I talked about earlier. It creates happier people, less depression, better emotional well-being and connection, more self-esteem, better empathy, better regulation of our emotions. We're more productive and engaged at work, and we're even more profitable, and we live longer. So other than that, there are no benefits of connection. So how do we foster it? The first thing is University of Michigan has identified these hugely beneficial but simple steps, 3 steps: respectful engagement, what they call task enabling, and play. So the first 2 are a little bit obscure. Let me unbundle them so you understand what we're talking about. Respectful engagement is basically when you're working with colleagues or clients or anyone in the workplace, when you, by the way you behave, by the tone of voice, by the way you interact with them, you show esteem and dignity, and you show that you're caring for them, you basically increase the connection. And when you do the opposite, you diminish the connection. And it really is very impactful. It can be, there's other research at Harvard showing that it affects you 3 degrees of separation. So when you are channeling negative emotions, when you are acting superior to somebody else, or you hold them in contempt, they not only feel it, but it affects their relationship with someone else and that person's relationship with someone else. So the first thing that produces this respectful engagement is presence. Presence is, you have my full attention. In fact, one of these can really ruin relationships. Not just checking your text or your mail. There's one study showing even having a phone in the room on the table. If somebody knows that it's within your reach, it's distracting. So put your phone away. Be fully present. It really makes a difference. Number 2, affirmation. When somebody feels like you respect me, you value me as a human being, you see my worth, that builds connection. Number 3, when you express gratitude. Gratitude is extremely powerful as a human emotion. And the research shows that when I tell you something I'm grateful for, anything from a simple thank you to a longer, more customized, boy, you really went out of your way for X, Y, and Z, and I really appreciate it. You didn't have to do that. It made my life much easier, and I'm grateful for it. That type of longer expression is even more powerful. But when we express gratitude, we're not only expressing gratitude, but we're building connection and helping both you and the other person to feel better. Task enabling involves interpersonal actions that help the other person complete something or to perform a task. So it can be as simple as giving needed information to somebody, giving emotional support to somebody, giving somebody a reference or a set of research that you've done, or pointing them toward a person in the court system that you already know that would be helpful, or whatever it is. Giving somebody something voluntarily that you didn't have to give them, that you reached out and said, here, this will make it easier for you to do your job. That's task enabling. And then play. So the best example of play is I work with a number of firms that at their annual retreat often will do skits. And the associates often get to do skits that, you know, playfully mock the partners. And some of these skits are hysterical, but they have very, very important benefits. Just like play for children is rehearsal for adult behaviors, play in a law firm can foster risk-taking behavior. It trains us, normally risk-averse people, to try things that we wouldn't normally try. It increases connection, because when we play, our guard is down. We're more likely to connect during play. It lets us try out new roles that we wouldn't otherwise do. And the status, I'm a partner, you know, you're an associate. In these skits, those barriers disappear, they melt away. So it reduces the confining hierarchy of status. What are some other things that build social connection? When you do things together. So when you have a firm retreat, I've often heard partners over the years say, firm retreats are a waste of time. We're not productive because we're not billing time. Well, they're productive in a different way. When you share an experience like a retreat, it's bonding. It makes you all feel part of the firm. We are part of something bigger than myself. And so it's very important for connection. I've already talked about empathy. I want to just highlight that it's an important tool in building connection. Research out of University of North Carolina shows that 1 second or more of eye contact produces copious amounts of the hormone oxytocin, which is the love hormone. It's the hormone that makes us feel connected to each other. And by producing that oxytocin, it bonds us. It makes us feel connected. So don't lose the opportunity to make direct eye contact. This is also key in presence. If I'm not looking at you, I don't feel like you're present, or if you're not looking at me. So eye contact. Now, don't take it too far, because if you're staring at somebody, that makes them feel creeped out. So it's just, you know, use your judgment to make appropriate eye contact. And if you're wondering, does it work on video? The higher the quality video, the more likely the eye contact will actually work. So if you get a full close-up with high definition, that will invoke this same trigger. Be vulnerable. Take emotional risks within, within reason. Use your judgment here. Share private things, even though we're not generally as, people psychologically inclined to disclose stuff. When you share something, even a safe, superficial something, it invites trust because you've entrusted me with some private information, and it deepens the connection with other people. Be authentic. Some of us have kind of a mask that we wear in the workplace, personality-wise, that hides our true self. And when you can be your authentic self, it really deepens connection. And then finally, smiling. So if you have a pen or a pencil, this is really interesting. We know that when people are happy, they smile. But did you know that when you smile, it makes you happier? So if you put a pen or a pencil or a finger in your teeth, it forms the muscles of the smile. It activates the muscles of the smile. Even though it's artificial, it actually has a psychological effect. Now, I'm not saying you should walk around with a pencil in your teeth, but I'm saying if you can find a way to be mindful and channel a smile, it's contagious. It makes other people smile genuinely, and it evokes positive emotions, and it makes it easier to connect. Think about it. Who do you want to connect with? Do you want to hang around people who are negative and pessimistic and dour and, grim looking? Or do you want to hang around people who are happy and smiling and approachable? So in addition to restoring the 3 disrupted needs, I want to finish with a couple of other evidence-based scientific techniques that can help you to not only restore the disrupted needs, but these are things that can help you feel calm in the face of a crisis, that can restore your psychological equilibrium, and that can build positive resources so that you're really bulletproof for stressors that occur down the road. Every one of these things can manage stress. So even when there's stressful events outside that you can't control, you can control these things, and it fortifies you against those upcoming stressors. So what else can we do to thrive? I want to start with selfless behaviors. So top of the list is pro bono, or any other kind of volunteer work. Research shows that when we volunteer, we are taking ourselves out of ourself and putting our attention on what can we do for others. There's all kinds of different research that boils down to stepping outside of ourself. When we are outside of ourself, when we feel connected to something bigger than us, when we are focused on helping, when we're giving to other people, when we're doing pro bono, when we're volunteering, any of those behaviors tend to elevate us and make us feel better, more resilient, happier, etc. It also reduces depressive thinking in people, which for lawyers, since we have an elevated risk of depression, is a good thing. It gives us a more of a sense of purpose and meaning. Volunteering in particular, and pro bono in particular, can often build skills because it gives us a chance to try things we might not have done before. In volunteering for older folks, it gives them more stamina. They stay more physically and mentally acute. It definitely reduces stress. There's studies showing that people who volunteer are less stressed than people who don't. And it increases your immune response, which can help you live longer. But above all, it builds connection. Next, I mentioned earlier that that I step out to our garden, and there's a lot of growing research on nature and the importance of appreciating nature. So going into a walk in the woods or an arboretum, viewing a body of water, an ocean, a lake, a stream, having a view from a high position, looking at a vista. Houseplants can trigger the same positive response. If you don't have any of that, looking at high definition videos like the naturalist David Attenborough, who I believe is in his 90s now, he's done these remarkable videos in jungles, under the oceans, in the plains, just videos where he takes you into the nitty-gritty details of nature to show you how nature functions and the beauty of nature. All of these moments spent in the natural world, uncluttered by man-made things, is restorative and protective. Pay attention to the good. Train your brain to counteract our special training to look for the negative by also training your brain to look for the positive. You can do this in a very simple way. And this is based on a study that was done 15 years ago in research, and it's been replicated over 100 different times with the same result. People who do what I'm about to describe to you thrive. And that is, every night when you come home, or every night even if you stay at home, review your day and think of what were the 3 moments in my day that produced positive emotions, 3 good things that happened today. The only criteria is that each moment was a moment where you felt positive in some way. You could feel uplifted, you could feel connected, you could feel serene, you could feel excited, you could feel interested. Doesn't matter what the positive emotion is, it's a moment where it felt good. So write down the 3 moments. Just give them a name. I witnessed an act of beauty. The sun rose. I held the door open for an elderly person. Whatever it was, write it down. And then take a moment, take 60 seconds to revisit in your mind that positive moment from earlier in the day. What was it like? What was the emotion? How did it feel? Marinate in the positive feelings for 60 seconds, and then go on to the second thing and do the same, and the third. The next night, same time. It's best to do this at the same time every day. 3 new things that happened that day. And if you want to do this with a significant other, a spouse, family, kids, friends, you can do that. It's enhancing to build relationship into this exercise, but it can be done alone. And the idea is that after you do this for a few days, two things happen. One is you're regularly, consciously, mindfully marinating in these positive emotions. And two, you're training your brain each day to look for new positive experiences, which might be there all the time and you just weren't seeing them. Because your brain is thinking, oh, I got to do that 3 good things thing tonight. I wonder what's going to qualify. Oh, maybe this is a good thing. So you start scanning for the good, which offsets the bad. Don't worry, for those of you who are thinking, oh, what if I lose my edge as a lawyer? It will not undo the negative skills that you have, the skills of looking for issues, because neural pathways are easy to create but hard to undo. So the training you have as a lawyer, it's there for good. You're just building new neural pathways alongside it. And then the last thing is, we all have this, some sort of chyron in our TV feed that says breaking news. And have you noticed there are more and more and more of these, and they're sillier and more inconsequential because we have so many outlets for news media. They're all struggling to get your attention, and what gets your attention is problems. So breaking news is a way of doing that. Well, some of them are negative, and 2 to 3 hours before sleep, you don't really want to expose your mind to these negative things. So I recommend that you avoid any bad news before you go to sleep, whether it's TV, radio, text, internet. And in fact, if you go to my blog site, lawyerbrainblog.com, one of the recent posts I did is about finding good news. And there are some websites that will deliver directly to your email inbox good news every day. So it can offset this. Instead of looking for the negative, your brain's, again, looking for the positive. So I thank you very much. I want to turn to Q&A. I see we have in the chat room a couple of questions. So let me address those. And let's see, the slides, will they be available for us? Yes. I will definitely give Lindsay a copy of the slides to give to everybody. Lindsay, do we have any Q&A that we that have come in?
Let me take a look. I don't see any, but let's give everyone a moment to stick those in there. If anybody has any questions, please put those in the chat or in the Q&A for us. I am also going to send out the recording to everyone, and I will also put Dr. Richard's contact information in there. So if anybody wants to reach out to him directly, either to talk further, or if you have any questions that you want to speak to him privately about, you can do that. So if there are any questions, we're going to give everybody, oh, here we go. Sharon asks if you have any tips on convincing other lawyers in your life to adopt these without them feeling criticized or threatened.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say about that is that the very question itself contains the problem. Convince is the key word that I'm looking at. So when we convince is a skill that we're trained to use in law school. And inside the box called the game of practicing law, convincing is an accepted strategy because we have two arguably equal participants and a neutral trier effect who can decide the dispute. When you're talking to your spouse, there's no trier effect. It's you and the other person. When you're talking to a colleague and you want to convince them of something, think about it. What does any lawyer do when you argue with them you should or you shouldn't do something? The first thing the other person does is, oh yeah? Well, let me tell you why you're wrong. And we marshal our own arguments. So if you want to defeat the other person accepting your ideas, try to convince them of them. So that's not going to work. What does work? I commend you to a book by Jonah Berger, Jonah Berger, called The Catalyst. And Dr. Berger is a marketing professor at Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania. And he has studied all of the techniques that actually do work to convince people of stuff without convincing them of stuff. So I commend that to you as a very excellent resource on that. What's the next question?
Michael asked, do you not find that empathy EQ has gone up during the pandemic?
So that reminds me that I haven't clarified, Michael, the distinction between the two kinds of empathy. There are two basically different kinds of empathy. One is called emotional empathy, and that's the kind that you're talking about here. Oh, I feel, so compassionate, so supportive of you because you're going through this horrible thing. We all have that. And it's hard not to have that come forth. Most people will have that response. Cognitive empathy is a different type of empathy. It shouldn't even have the same name because it activates a different region of the brain entirely. It works differently. It's more intellectual, not emotional. Cognitive empathy, the one that I've been talking about today, is the perspective-taking empathy. It's, do I understand your world? Can I step into your shoes accurately and see what your life is like? Can I ask questions like, the thing I'm about to say or the behavior I'm about to do, how will it land? How will it be received by you? How will it affect you? That's cognitive empathy. So they're different empathies, and the cognitive empathy has zero impact on whether you are compassionate in a time of crisis.
Okay. Jim asks if you can speak to respectful engagement tips in a remote setting, especially.
Sure. One of the first things to do is to check in on your own urgency. So we have a tendency as lawyers, you're sitting in your office and you're doing an intake with a new client, and the client says something and you interrupt them and say, no, I want to learn, I want to find out this. You try to zero in on the most important thing because you know what's relevant to a legal issue and what isn't. And we often cut off the client in the middle of their talking because we want to get to the nub of the issue. Well, that's good for helping the client, even though it seems a little bit disruptive and maybe rude, it's in their own interest. When you're on a call with somebody, especially if it's a non-work call, it's not in their interest to interrupt. And it signals disrespectful engagement. So stop the habit or confine that habit to the intake process and don't use it in calls with people. The second thing is what I said about eye contact. Look directly at the camera so people see you looking at them. Number 3 is don't multitask. Do not, when you're talking to somebody and they say, yeah, that's a good point. That when they're talking is a sign that their brain's also thinking of something else. And it doesn't fly. People hear that tone in your voice. They know you're multitasking. They know you're doing email while you're talking to them. So don't do that.
Michael asked a great question, is if you can spend a few minutes on the difference in genders with lawyers in the stats that you've presented.
Oh, great. One of my favorite questions. So as a general rule, personality in the general public, first of all, most personality tests, they try really hard to identify recurring traits that are independent of gender. Now, because nature is what nature is, there are some traits that do differ among the genders. So for example, men cope with stress better than women. There are certain personality traits related to stress coping. Women tend to be a little bit better on empathy and on sociability. Here's the interesting thing. In the legal profession, those differences, all 3 of the ones I mentioned, disappear, and they disappear in the direction of men. So women who are generally worse at managing stress in the legal profession, we get some tough women entering this profession who look just like men in terms of stress management. In terms of sociability, we get women who are less sociable than women in the general population. They look more like the male lawyers. And we get lower empathy women. These are generalizations. Are there exceptions? Yes. And when I look at the exceptions, the women are usually better at these things than men. But in the aggregate, there are fewer of those exceptional women than in the general population. So there's definitely a tendency, a tilt, a trend in favor of diminishing, wiping out gender differences toward the direction of everyone looking like typical males in the legal profession.
Interesting. Okay. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up from anybody? We'll give them just a second to type them in.
These are great questions.
They are great questions. I really appreciate everyone's contributions, and I hope everyone's gotten a lot out of this. As I mentioned, this session was recorded, so I will share the recording in our daily digest with everybody on the conference, and we'll also make the slides available to you, as well as Dr. Richards' contact information. Okay, we don't seem to have any other questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Richard. This was really exceptional, and I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for attending and your wonderful questions. We really appreciate those too. We look forward to seeing you for the rest of the conference. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity, Lindsay. My pleasure.
Thank you.